philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The pandemic isn't over, but as Ontario reopens, there are definitely glimpses of normal coming back. We'll hear about some of those tonight, including what lifting the latest round of restrictions includes. Then, Steve talks to one-time Canadian Athlete of the Year, Bruce Kidd, whose new memoir details his running life and a lifetime of activism. It's Thursday, October 28th, and that's coming up on the agenda. As of Monday, Ontario is no longer in Step 3 and is transitioning to what the government calls a plan to safely reopen Ontario and manage COVID-19 for the long term. Many people were thrilled it meant capacity limits were lifted. But there's a lot there, even just in the title of their plan. Let's find out more with in the nation's capital, Rewat Dionandan, epidemiologist and associate professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Ottawa. And in Burlington, Ontario, Laura Stone, reporter for the Global Mail's Queen's Park Bureau. Welcome back to you both.
Thank you.
Hey there.
So I did something that I haven't done all pandemic. This past weekend, I went out. I was outside. I went to a football game, and I kind of felt okay because they asked for my vaccine passport. Even though I was in an area where everybody was, it kind of felt good to be outside. So Laura, I think a lot of people are very excited that we seem to be moving forward. Can you tell us what's changed? What does it mean now that Ontario has exited Step 3 of the roadmap for reopening?
Well, you're right, Nam. It's certainly feeling like a lot more of a hopeful time, and people are actually being encouraged to get out there and do things again, which I know that everyone has sorely missed over the past 18 months. Essentially, what Ontario has done is kind of transition from a stage of their plan with that imposed capacity limits on certain settings to one that lifts them as long as proof of vaccination is required. So the final step in that was restaurants and gyms, and those lifted earlier this week. So if you show your vaccination status, if you've been vaccinated or have some sort of exemption, those places can now open at maximum capacity. And Ontario has done this for a number of settings, including, as you mentioned, football stadiums. I went to a baseball game when the Jays were still in it. And so everyone had to show their proof of vaccination in order to do that. And the government is now kind of proposing a way out or a way forward from COVID restrictions, which details in the new year a way to both end the vaccine requirements as well as lift mask mandates early in the spring in March of next year, which is the government's stated goal there.
So Rewat, this reopening is going to take about 6 months. The second part of that title is Manage COVID-19 for the long term. What does that signal from your viewpoint?
It signals two things. One, the acceptance of likely endemicity of this virus sometime in the near future. There's also a bit of surrender baked in there, to be honest. We look at Portugal, for example, that has 87% vaccination, and they're throwing the doors more or less wide open while maintaining their vaccine passports and masking mandates and so forth. They've accepted endemic status. However, they're seeing about 800 cases a day still, and their population is 2/3 the size of Ontario. I think 800 cases a day for Ontario is too much to tolerate. We're down to fewer than, I think, 500 now. So I think there's something to be said for keeping our foot on the brake longer to drive the incidence rate lower so that when we do accept the endemic state, it'll be at a much lower level of transmission. So I don't like the idea of tying the opening to calendar dates. It should be tied to objective epidemiological indicators that we observe in the population.
Well, I just wanted to follow up with you on that, Rewat, because there was blowback for the government because the capacity limits for large venues were lifted ahead of small businesses like restaurants. What do you make of the timing of the reopening?
It seems to coincide with some sporting events. So maybe someone's got the ear of some powerful people to say, well, this makes more sense economically for the population. I can't really comment on that. I think so long as we're investing in the appropriate public health assets in all venues, like ventilation, mandatory masking, and empowering the owners of such venues to enforce these mandates accordingly, it shouldn't be an issue overall. The timing of who goes first is more of a political issue in my mind.
Well, Laura, let me follow up with you on that because we do know that there is a provincial election coming up in June. What does the reopening policies say to you about what the Ontario government wants to say politically?
Well, I don't think you could ignore the election, and I think it's no coincidence that these health restrictions are tied to dates that predate the election period. And I think there's certainly, a hopeful optimism, I'll put it that way, on the part of the Ford government that the worst of this pandemic will be over by next June, and they can start to talk about other things. But I mean, politically speaking, you cannot ignore the fact that there's an election in June, and so everything, be it the vaccine passports, the mask mandates lifting, is tied to that. And we've heard Premier Ford talk about his discomfort with vaccine mandates. He's openly talked about them creating a split society, and the government has so far resisted instituting them for healthcare workers, for instance, or education workers, citing a concern over losing the very valuable staff during the pandemic. So I do think that this is both kind of a nod to the general public. People are extremely tired of COVID, obviously, and our vaccination rate is now at 84% for 2 shots, 88 for 1. Most of the public has done their work and went out and got vaccinated. I also think, though, it's a nod to his progressive conservative base and the Conservatives who have been frustrated with the government restrictions throughout this pandemic, who don't like the idea of vaccine passports, and especially businesses who still talk about the fact that their revenue is down, and even with vaccine passports, it is hurting their bottom line. So I think that there's kind of both a message to the general public, but also to conservatives that the government is trying to get back to kind of their bread and butter issues, which is the economy, businesses, growing businesses, less red tape, and kind of those issues that Premier Ford was elected on back in 2018.
There's a TikToker who went viral. She said that, I have to send it to you after the show, that the pandemic isn't over even though you're over it. And the Registered Nurses Association has said that this plan is risky because we're going into the winter. Flu season is coming up. And so, Laura, I wanted to follow up on you with that, because I also think that the government has to, it's a very delicate balance for them, because I don't think they want to go back into a lockdown, because that wouldn't be good for them politically. So do you see the government setting itself up for yet another reversal?
Well, it has been the pattern. And I think when we all saw those specific dates laid out by the government and the chief medical officer, it was kind of like deja vu all over again of the way that this government has continually kind of cataloged things and then had to reverse them, whether it was, keeping schools open and then closing them, or not having any more lockdowns and then having to impose restrictions back on businesses. We are in a different situation now with our vaccination rate, and we've heard from the chief medical officer, Dr. Kieran Moore, about cases inevitably rising in the winter and trying to signal that and telling people not to panic. But I think that there was a lot of skepticism when the government came out and released these specific dates. And they even say, individual public health units can impose their own restrictions or make changes if they deem fit. But I do think that the problem that this government has run into is continually setting up expectations for themselves that they then have to back down from. So I think that is a risk here for the Ford government.
And Ray Watt, I want to ask you the same question.
Well, there are a lot of unknowns here, and these unknowns have to do with the timing of activities leading to potential spikes. We still don't know the impact of the Thanksgiving spike, if there will be a spike. We don't know what's going to happen after Halloween. Hopefully nothing happens after Halloween, but if young people are having indoor parties and young people are more likely to be unvaccinated, we'll probably see some increase in cases. We don't know what will happen when the weather gets really bad and people are spending more time indoors. The vaccine passports control the super spreading events in formal environments like restaurants and bars, but not informal environments like people's houses. Christmas is coming up, where people are going to be spending a lot more time intimately with potentially strangers. So there's every reason to expect an increase in cases coming up. Having said that, there seems to be a reliance on the awesome power of vaccination to get us through this. And vaccination is astonishing. It is actually the path out of this. But vaccination only has a power if married to appropriate policy levers, by which I mean vaccine mandates and the vaccine passports. By putting an expiration date that's linked to a calendar date on those two policy levers, we're in many ways cutting the feet out from under the awesome power of vaccination. So if they're banking on the science of vaccines to prevent them from repeating the mistakes of the past 2 years, by which I mean the yo-yo effect of opening things up too soon and closing down, etc., it may not come to pass if you're not allowing these policy tools to run their course naturally. So I strongly advocate for us to maintain the vaccine passport, if we could call it that, well past January, but not interminably. What does this mean? It means we're in unknown territory, frankly. And when you're in unknown territory, it behooves us to act more conservatively, to open things up slowly so we do not repeat the mistakes of the past.
It seems in the past, what's happened in Ontario is that some policies are set, then there is pushback from the public, and then the government kind of reverses its position. Laura, Raywat mentioned with the vaccine, kind of giving people an out that come January, the vaccine passports will no longer be required. What do you think that says to people who might not be vaccinated right now?
Well, I think, I think there's kind of two categories of people in that. I think there are people who are hesitant, who want more education or who need more education on it, who need more of a guidance and a helping hand, as opposed to overt criticism or anger on the part of the public or the medical community in order to get vaccinated. And those people are still out there, and there's a lot of work on the ground that needs to be done to bring them along. And then I do think there's, a proportion of the public who are simply anti-vaccination, anti-vaxxers who wouldn't get vaccinated anyway. And Health Minister Christine Elliott this week talked about that when she was asked why her government would put an end date on vaccine mandates if they're trying to encourage more people to get vaccinated. And she essentially said, well, those people aren't going to get vaccinated anyway. So it is a bit of a catch-22 here. And it does seem like these vaccine mandates have only just gotten started. So the government's putting a 3 or 4 month timeline on them. But by the same token, I do think the public wants some sort of signal that they won't go on forever, that life will at some point get back to normal. And so they need to give people some sort of hope in that respect that this isn't going to go on forever.
Raywat, I saw you nodding.
Yeah, and the way you signal that it will not go on forever is to tie the lifting of these mandates to epidemiological indicators that are objective and that are not political.
Such as?
Well, the three indicator categories I like to talk about: the health systems indicators, the epidemiology ones, and the population ones. The population indicators are the proportion of people who become vaccinated. The epidemiology indicators are the incidence rate and the test positivity rate. And the health systems indicators are how much space we have in our healthcare system. Now, we have a lot of space right now, and we're using that space to service refugees from Saskatchewan and Alberta and places like that. And the population indicators are trending the right way, meaning a lot of people are getting vaccinated. Not enough yet. We need substantially more. And the epi indicators are the ones that I'm watching most closely. When that incidence rate drops really low and stays low for a long time, then we can start having the conversation about, is there sufficient population immunity now to lift more of these mitigation tools and to, quote unquote, live with the disease, which is a phrase I hate, but one will probably have to be using more and more.
Well, what do you think about the mask mandate being lifted in March?
My spouse, who's a family doctor, and I have a bet going back many months. I felt the mask mandate would have been lifted by Christmas, and she felt, nope, it's going on much longer than that. And I'm wrong, because I didn't anticipate the slow vaccine uptake. I didn't anticipate the awesome power of Delta stultifying the world again. And I think she is right, and I think she's right to push it a little further than that. March is not a bad, or spring is not a bad timeline to aim for, but to actually put it on the calendar is a mistake. If you look at Portugal again, Portugal is now being watched by the world because they have close to 100% of their eligible population vaccinated, and their economy is opening up, but they're still struggling with a fairly high incidence rate, in my opinion. They're maintaining their masks in public spaces. They're maintaining the vaccine passport in important ways. So why would we want to do less than Portugal when they have a higher incidence rate than us? It doesn't make much sense to me, especially since masks are the lowest hanging fruit. They're the cheapest intervention we can have. You put one in your pocket, your kids can wear them, whatever. They don't require mass investments in infrastructure change. They don't require mass policy changes. They're just simply a piece of fabric over your face. And they'll probably naturally fall away from use sometime in the summer anyway. So again, the problem is tying it to a calendar date. There is a natural evolution and deterioration of these mitigation strategies that we will see as time goes on.
And Laura, Premier Ford has said that this is a very cautious plan, that if they do need to pivot, that they would pivot. Oh my gosh, that word again. And and some people, are very happy about these reopening plans, and some sectors are not so happy about it. So how does what sectors does this make happy, and what sectors does this not make some people happy?
Look, I think the small business community has been stung repeatedly by this government, and they've expressed a lot of displeasure throughout the process. I think kind of the final nail in the coffin for them was the reopening of the sports stadiums before small businesses like restaurants and gyms were able to fully open at full capacity. And it just seems like, time and again, this government, whether deliberately or not, continually kind of undermines them. And this is their core base. So I know that small businesses have talked about the need for more support. They also want these passports lifted, though, because they say that it's still impacting their business. So I think what Ontario is trying to do is achieve a balance right now. I think what you don't see that kind of groundswell of very vocal criticism from epidemiologists and the medical community that you saw at various times throughout this pandemic. There is still a lot of pressure on the government for vaccine mandates for healthcare workers and others right now. And of course, the next chapter too is vaccinating children. So we're certainly not out of it. There's certainly still concerns, but I do think that we're kind of in a steady state right now in Ontario, where the numbers comparatively to other provinces are doing very well. We're able to keep most of businesses open. The vaccine uptake is still, objectively speaking, compared to some other places, good. And so they're trying to kind of maintain this until the new year. Again, I think the question is, are they removing or making promises too early before Ontario is for sure going to be out of this, and that there's no more risk to spread or an increase in cases, particularly in schools, and whether our hospitals are going to be okay heading into the new year.
I can just imagine someone going to the gym and sitting beside somebody without a mask. And with everything that we've learned during this pandemic, it just seems as if once we've got something handled, something else comes up. And Raywat, are you worried that this might create a more resistant variant?
Oh, that's always in the back of our minds. The variant farming around the world is the crisis, or the threat that keeps epidemiologists up late at night. But the public shouldn't worry about it too much. Let the experts worry about that. And frankly, we think about variants in three categories: variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of high consequence. And they're categorized based upon the variant's ability to compromise our ability to detect, treat, and prevent the disease. And so far, all the variants we've encountered are either variants of interest or variants of concern. We've seen no variants of high consequence yet, meaning all of the variants are susceptible to the awesome power of our vaccines to a very large extent. So I wouldn't worry too much about it just yet. But the production of variants must be watched carefully and must be prevented. And the way you prevent it is by diminishing transmission as much as possible. So we must always do everything we can to stop transmission, even when this disease becomes, quote unquote, endemic.
And Laura, Raywat just said this idea of it becoming endemic, just becoming something that's part of our lives that we live with. So that concept of normal, what will that look like in a few months from now?
I wish I knew, because I actually can't remember what normal life was like. But I think this is being kind of cataloged or foreshadowed by our public health officials. We've heard Dr. Moore talk about living with COVID. I don't know that this is ever going to go away. And of course, we're watching variants and other mutations of the virus to see what happens. But I think, when we talk about something like a mask mandate, I think it will be very interesting to see what the individual regions or the public health units choose to do, because I think there will be a lot will take matters into their own hands and potentially extend that themselves or impose it in a variety of settings, similar to what we saw throughout the pandemic, where Toronto, for instance, made up their own rules or imposed more stringent rules than what the province was proposing. So I'm not sure that in March 2022, masks are going to disappear from our society. I think there'll be a lot of people still wearing them. I think there'll be a lot of regions that will still be imposing them. I think they'll still probably be on flights. So I do think the storyline to watch here is sort of what the individual regions come up with and how that maybe differs from what the province has proposed in its own plan.
And Rewa, we might have a plan for how this province reopens. And like Laura said, different municipalities have different rules in place. We are living in a world where there's still a lot of people, a lot of countries that don't have access to these vaccines. And COVID is still going very strong around the world. So what good are our reopening plans in those kind of situations?
Excellent question. You can't talk about Ontario in isolation. We exist in the context of a global community with globalized travel, globalized trade, and so forth. As a new variant emerges in India or South Africa or Brazil, it compromises and threatens the entire world. So it behooves us to use whatever power we have, whatever resources we have, to help quash the epidemic everywhere in the world. It's possible that the epidemic ends locally, meaning in Ontario and possibly all of Canada, sometime early next year, and we enter endemic phase, which is not necessarily a good thing, by the way. But the epidemic will rage on around the world for at least 1 to 4 more years. And we can shorten that from years to months if we really ramp up our vaccine production and exportation and help the rest of the world catch up to us in terms of our community immunity. That's our way out of this, is getting every human being on the planet immunized as quickly as possible.
We've got 1 minute left, but I have to ask this question because last Halloween, I ended up eating all the candy, which was not great. And I'm sure a lot of people are watching and wondering about Halloween. Should their kids go trick-or-treating? Should you give candy at the door? What would you recommend, Ray Watt?
Yeah, go trick-or-treating. Make it outside. Keep your distance from the door. Give out candy, accept candy, stay 5 to 6 feet away if you can. Don't linger too long in front of someone else's face, and wear a mask, and not just a Halloween mask, and you'll be perfectly fine. The candy itself is fine. Enjoy the candy.
Rewa and Laura, thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing during this pandemic and helping us to understand these complex issues. We appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
COVID-19 and the accompanying lockdowns walloped small business. One sector hit particularly hard were gyms and fitness centers. Earlier this week, they got the green light to ditch capacity limits and welcome back a full complement of patrons. And with us now on that, in Niagara Falls, Ontario, there's Maria Arshad. She is the owner of Anytime Fitness in St. Catharines, Ontario. Maria, it's great to meet you. Welcome to TVO. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about today.
Well, terrific. We're happy to have you. Tell us about your place. How long have you owned it for?
I've had my club for about 3 years, and our facility has been there for 10 years total.
Okay.
And we love to be a part of the community here. I feel like the St. Catharines community is very supportive of fitness and health and nutrition.
How many people belong there?
We have about 950 members.
Wow. So that's a lot of people who depend on you to stay in shape.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
And we're always happy to have them.
I'll bet you are. Tell me this, over the past 19 months since COVID-19 hit, how many times have you been closed down?
We've been closed for a total of 3 times. Of course, March 2020, when COVID first hit, we thought we were going to be closed for about 2 weeks. Literally March 17th is when we were given the go to close down, and we put up a sign at our door that we'll be back on April 1st, thinking it'd be like a nice little break to understand what's going on in the world. And we had no idea we'd be closed for 3.5 months.
Oh, so it really was not April 1st at all. It was much longer than that.
Much longer, and a lot of uncertainty. After the 2 weeks were gone, we weren't sure what was going to happen. Weren't sure what was going to happen to any of our businesses. Nothing was open. So it was very stressful, very challenging time for at least the small businesses.
So you got closed for 3.5 months, then you reopened again for how long?
We were open from July 16th to December 26th. So,
And they shut you down again?
They shut us down again in December, right before, I believe it was the day after Christmas. We got shut down till March 1st. And then we opened for 1 month. And then again, we were shut down April 2nd of 2021.
At what point were you ready to start pulling your hair out?
Well, when we reopened in July 2020, we were very excited to be open, just thinking that, this is done. We know what's going on with this virus, how to contain it. We were very surprised to be closed in December, but lots of challenges along the way just to meet the laws that were ever changing. So very challenging time for all of us.
I imagine when you bought the place 3 years ago, you had no idea you would be having to deal with something like this, right?
No, absolutely not.
So,
absolutely not.
What was it like trying to run a place that the government told you open, shut, open, shut, open, shut for 19 months? What's that been like?
Honestly, it's been so challenging, and our members have been super supportive, but at the same time, we've faced a lot of members who didn't understand the situation of open, close. So there were lots of challenges along the way with retention, keeping our members motivated, getting them to come back to our facility, to the gym environment. They just felt so unsafe. They thought the only place safe was their home. So having to come, getting them out of the house and to rethink about their health and fitness was a really big challenge for us. Also, just navigating the governmental support, that was very challenging as well. The government, we're very grateful to have the support from the government, but we feel at the same time that small businesses were overlooked tremendously, and just to navigate through that. As well as, all the new rules that keep changing on a weekly basis. There's something new for your industry that you had to, kind of work into your business model, and to, just evolve on a weekly basis was very challenging.
Right. So you had, there were various things that you'd have to do in order to fulfill provincial protocols and that kind of thing. And I guess, obviously, when the club was shut down, your members, they didn't have to pay anything to join at that time, right? You forgave their monthly fees at that point?
Oh, yeah. So no service was being offered. So everybody's membership was frozen. And when we reopened, membership resumed again.
Okay. In which case, how did you manage with no money coming in? Because the fact that no money's coming in didn't mean you still didn't have expenses you had to deal with.
Oh, yeah. So originally, when the rent subsidy was announced, our biggest expense is rent. So when that was announced, we were very grateful for to have that option, but it only covers 65% of your total expenses. So the rest of that we had to figure out. So that was financially very challenging, and we're very grateful that we're still a functioning business, and we were able to get through that. But it was very challenging to just the uncertainty of being not open and to not being able to run a business. It was very stressful.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did mention earlier that there was a bit of a backlash along the way. Give us a sense of what kind of stuff you faced.
Well, when we reopened in July, there were a lot of people who were very eager to be back. They were very grateful. They had a new appreciation for fitness. And then there were the other part of our members who were very scared to be back, and they didn't want anything to do with a fitness environment. They just felt that when so many people are working out, it would be an unsafe environment for them and their families. So they tried to, they reached out to us and we said, we'd be happy to freeze your membership further. No extra fees, nothing. But people were very frustrated and upset and angry. And they attacked us the only way they could was through social media and leaving negative reviews on Google. And, the service industry relies on reviews online to run their business now. And anyone who is looking for anything, they will Google the nearby businesses and check out the reviews to see if this is, where they should be spending their money. And those reviews definitely hurt us a lot. But luckily, people started to understand that, we are just like them. We're a small business. We're a locally owned business. I have a small family. I have 2 small children. I'm just like them. So I think that initial anger did get us a lot of negative press in our reviews, but then people did started to understand where we're coming from as well. So it worked out at the end, but it was very hard to kind of navigate people's feelings about the whole situation.
No, I'm sure, and I'm glad to see you're turning the corner right now. But do you recall what was the one thing on social media that you read that some perhaps less generous person put up there that really hurt you?
I feel like since COVID was such a big topic, when they were hurt, they would use COVID as their biggest weapon. They would be like, this place is not doing the right things in their facility to make it safe for you. So that really hurt us because we were doing everything we thought possible to be a safe place for our members to work out. And we were sanitizing every hour for 15 minutes, staffing our facility and paying very close attention to that. So that really hurt us because at that time COVID was so big, and when they attack you like that, you're very hurt because you're like, we're doing everything that we need to be doing, and still you're upset about your situation, so you're attacking us in that way.
Yeah, and Maria, let me just ask, to confirm, to the best of your knowledge, nobody caught COVID-19 at your club?
Nobody did. And we have 84 Anytime Fitnesses in Ontario, and we ran the transmission rate. And last year in December 2020, the percentages we have was 0.01 across the 84 facilities that we have. So very, very, very small numbers of the transmission was very small, where it was almost non-existent.
And just to confirm again, you are back to full capacity now? The place is humming? You got lots of people in there? Back to normal?
Yes, back to normal. We're so happy to be open and so happy to be servicing our members in St. Catharines and the Thorold area.
And again, let me confirm, I presume when people show up at the registration desk at the beginning to check in, they do have to show that they've been vaccinated, yes?
Absolutely. We're a 100% fully vaccinated facility. So you must have your full vaccination in order for you to work out at our facility.
And have any of your members shown up at that front desk and said, well, I haven't got my vaccination yet, but come on, just let me in?
Absolutely. We have those people, but we ask them, like, as soon as you have your second shot, you have the 14-day wait period. As soon as you're done with your 14 days, we would love to have you back. Until then, we will freeze your membership for free, and you have nothing to worry about payments or anything coming through. So we're here for you when you're ready to come back, and we are, we want to make healthy happen in your life. So that's our motto, really. Anybody make a stink when you tell them they got to go away for now? Honestly, those people who don't believe in being vaccinated, they do mention how this is not right. But we remind them that, we want to be back to normal, and we want to, do you remember a time when we were normal? We want to be back there, and we want everybody to feel safe in this environment. So unfortunately, at this time, we wouldn't be able to have you at our facility. And I feel like if you talk to them in like a human level, they always appreciate that, and they understand at this point. 19 months into it, they understand for sure.
I want to ask you one last question, Maria, and that is, was there a moment when you thought to yourself, my goodness, there's got to be an easier way to make a living than this. To hell with it. I'm shutting the doors and walking away.
Well, like I said, it's been very challenging, but I love fitness. I love helping people, and I love being open. So I didn't think about that, because this is our life, and I feel like our members are our community. So no, I didn't feel that, but we're just very excited to be fully vaccinated and to just be fully open and thriving.
And do you think you're open for good now?
Oh yes, absolutely.
No more shutdowns.
No more shutdown.
Okay, gotcha. Maria, it's really good of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much. Anytime Fitness is Maria Arshad's place in St. Catharines, and she joined us tonight from Niagara Falls, Ontario. Take care, Maria, and thanks again.
Thank you so much.
The name Bruce Kidd may not mean what it should to a younger generation of Canadians, so particularly to you younger viewers, listen up. This guy may be the greatest long-distance runner this country has ever produced. He's also dedicated himself to creating a healthier Canada and has occasionally ruffled feathers to do so. He calls himself a jockraker rather than a muckraker, but you get the idea. His new memoir is now out. It's called A Runner's Journey. And we're delighted that it brings Bruce Kidd to our program from the Regal Heights part of Midtown in Ontario's capital city. Bruce Kidd, it's great to see you again. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, Steve. Great to see you.
Well, you tell us you got into running long distance on a dare. Tell that story if you would.
Well, I love to run. I often ran by myself long distances, but I didn't have any explosive speed. And in the Waterworks neighborhood where I grew up and played all kinds of sports, I was continually the butt of jokes because other people could accelerate much faster than me. And one of those friends once challenged me to a race where he would run backwards and I would run forwards. And although I claimed that it was because I was laughing so hard with embarrassment, he beat me. And so I continued to be the butt of those jokes. Well, at Malvern Collegiate, where I went to high school, there was a cross-country race a few weeks later, and I challenged him to a rematch, set off from the start with what I thought was a jog, and soon found myself all alone, 50, 75 yards ahead of everybody else, and I won that race easily. And then the high school track coach, John Grab, said, why don't you run for our Harrier team, cross-country team, which I did. And then in the spring, I ran track and field for Malvern. And surprise, surprise, I won both the then distance races, the 800 and the mile. And again, it was, I had all of this strength, which I didn't really appreciate because up until then, I'd only run shorter distances.
Well, let me ask you about that.
Mr.
Let me ask you
Grab,
about, because I want to know how much of your talent as a runner was because you trained your fanny off, and how much is because nature gave you a long-distance runner's body.
Well, I think it was a combination of both. I've always had very high VO2 uptake ratings, but then again, I ran long distances back and forth from school, back and forth to the various parks all my life. And then when I took up running, I always prided myself on training harder than anybody else, adding in extra workouts. So during my running heyday, I could line up on any starting line and say I was as strong or stronger than anybody else in that race. So I think I had a natural adaptation, but I also trained like crazy.
I'm going to remind you that I think it was 60 years ago this year that you were chosen Canada's Athlete of the Year. And you beat out some pretty well-known people. Boom Boom Jeffrion, who scored 50 goals that year, and the Grey Cup champion quarterback Bernie Filoni. What did it mean to you to beat those guys out and be considered this country's best athlete that year?
Well, it gave me tremendous pride and satisfaction, and it it forced me to adjust to being a public figure in a way I had always probably dreamed of, but never expected. It conferred through the informal ways that athletic success confers a sort of responsibility for being a representative of my sport and Canada. And in the communities that I was part of, that meant being responsible for both the best of the sport and the worst of the sport, and trying to fix the worst. And that began what I call the second part of my journey, but it was really a lifelong journey, learning to speak out against racism and injustice, and to represent the best of Canadian sport and Canadian society. As you know, because you've read the book, that was not an easy adjustment. Sometimes I found those responsibilities too onerous. Sometimes I found people thrusting positions on me which were far too conservative, far too obedient, far too English Canadian. So I chafed with some of those expectations. I fought with a lot of famous people, but many of them took me under their wings and tried to mentor me into keeping my messages, but delivering them in a softer, more acceptable way.
Well, having said that, how much have you enjoyed being a bit of a pain in the butt to the athletic establishment of this country over the last many decades?
Well, it certainly got their attention. And one of the things I discovered as people attacked me for those positions, particularly in the 1960s, when I fought with everybody, like the rest of my generation, I realized that even though they were disputing me, they listened to me and they focused on me. So I realized that almost unlike anybody else of my generation, and I don't think I'm exaggerating that, I became the go-to person for what Canadian youth and what Canadian sport youth are saying. So my controversial status, I mean, there were times, Steve, when that was almost my first name in some of the media, but that gave me a platform which then I had to learn how to use responsibly. And that was not an easy process, but because remember, I was immersed in the 60 generation, which was very impatient and very angry about things. But I gradually learned that there were a lot of good people out there who didn't hold my opinions, but would be open to listening to them. And I gradually learned to be, I'd like to think, you may not think, some of the people may not think, but I gradually learned to be a more diplomatic and respectful communicator.
Well, I guess not surprisingly, like a lot of people who want to have an impact and get stuff done, you decided, in fact, 50 years ago this month, to run for provincial parliament. And you ran for the NDP and had the misfortune of running into a new 41-year-old premier by the name of Bill Davis, and you did not win the seat that you sought. What did you think about Premier Davis and the kind of government he was providing at the time?
I was impatient. I'd worked for that government in two jobs. I knew him. I knew his predecessor, Premier Robarts, and they were among the men who took me aside and tried to give me advice, with whom I had these amazing discussions. But I was I felt they were far too obedient to American international capital, particularly Imperial Oil and those other multinationals in Toronto, and I felt that they did not push hard enough for a Canadian independence, and I would say social positions around the issues that I ran on, 24-hour daycare, women's right to choose whether she, women's right to choose, open access to abortion, and those kind of things, and they were the issues of my generation, and so although and it's not because I become mellow in my old age. Even then, I had a fondness for them, but they weren't prepared to go fast enough. I admired Bill Davis's shrewdness. I applauded when he stopped the Allen Expressway at Eglinton. That guaranteed him Toronto seats that otherwise we would have won. There was a lot to admire about him, but he was not prepared to go anywhere near as fast and as far as my generation wanted.
Well, you're a little bit ahead of your time because I think you ran in the Beach, right? Beaches Woodbine or Beaches East York, something like
right.
that? Right. That seat is one of the safest NDP seats going today, and had you run today instead of back then, you'd be an MPP. But then think of all the things you wouldn't have got to do. Tokyo Olympics, what's your strongest memory of having competed in that?
Well, it's I have many memories. Last night, I reviewed just happenstance the film of the 10,000 meter race, which brought back a slew of memories and what ifs. I would say, though, my most powerful memory was engaging with Japanese society and having people who spoke no English come up to me over and over again and saying, "No more Hiroshima." I was a part of the anti-nuclear movement, although I was a very minor player in that. But the emotion and the power of those personal testimonies, not only in Tokyo but all over Japan, had probably the most powerful effect on me. It taught me that the Olympics are not just a sports event, but they're an intercultural event. They're interconnected with the political agendas of the entire world and the hopes for a better world of the entire world. And I always had an idealistic vision of the Olympic movement, but Tokyo taught me that that's not just idealism, or my idealism is shared by people in many other countries which are quite different from my own.
Let me ask you a couple of more Olympic follow-ups, starting with Montreal, of course, hosted the Olympic Games in 1976, so there was a possibility that you'd be able to compete at an Olympic Games on your home soil, and it didn't happen. How come you didn't qualify, and how disappointed were you that you didn't get to participate in those games?
Well, I tried hard for those Olympics. I got injured, and while I recovered and ran in the trials, I didn't qualify. But at the same time, I was by then fully engaged in Olympic-related politics, and in my own way was part of 2 or 3 other projects. For a combination of reasons, which I outline in more detail in the book, I helped create a coalition of athletes and artists to ensure a respectable cultural festival at Montreal in the Olympic tradition, and helped produce a series of Canadian art posters, which was distributed to athletes and coaches from around the world. And I helped produce a play about Canadian athletes in the Olympic sports, which was staged as part of the Arts and Culture Festival, and then in the Olympic Village in a special theater for the athletes of the world. And that was an extraordinary high as well. And then I became involved in the struggle for funding for Canadian athletes, and used my political skills to create what is now essentially the Athlete Assistance Program. It's hard to believe, but at that time, most Canadian athletes were starved. They were living on welfare. They were stealing their food because the financial support was so awful. And Abby Hoffman, Chris Prayer-Bashinsky, Nancy Thompson, and others, and I created a coalition like an embryonic trade union to demand the the proper funding of those Canadian athletes. At one point, we said that if our demands were not met, we would go on strike and not compete in Montreal. And that strike threat immediately brought us the financial support that we needed. So in addition to training and trying to run, I was involved in several other highly emotionally charged Olympic projects. So overall, my disappointment on the running side was overcome or assuaged by some of our successes on the political and the organizing side.
Well, speaking of political, here's a political question for you. Given our relationship with China these days, should we send our athletes to participate in the Beijing Olympics?
I think Canadian athletes should compete in Beijing as they want to, but I think they should go with their eyes open, fully informed about the issues, with the right to speak out about them as they choose, and in discussion with other athletes in the Olympic Village and with their Chinese hosts. The overarching aspiration of the Olympic movement has been to bring people together under the auspices of sport and culture to learn about each other and try to develop peaceful ways of resolving world questions. That can't happen in 4 weeks, but that dialogue should occur in Beijing and should be protected. Canadian athletes are as horrified as I am about the genocide in West China, about the repression in Hong Kong, about the threats to Taiwan and so on. But they don't want to be the only ones who are symbolically withdrawing from China when Canadian trade with China is at record highs, when Canadian universities are accepting high numbers of Chinese students, and. If there was a countrywide effort to end relations with China, that would be another story, but that's not happening. So I think they should go and they should use the dome of the Olympic Village and the Olympic precincts to share their concerns with the Chinese they come in contact with. It's going to be difficult because COVID is going to restrict what happens in Beijing. We now know that the only spectators will be Chinese, domestic Chinese. So there will be limits to the World Village that was originally envisioned by the founders and is of course what happens most of the time. But they should go, race hard, but also use this as an opportunity to tell their Chinese hosts what they think about what is happening in their country, and to learn from those Chinese their very different perspective on those questions. I've been to China. I've had these discussions. They listen to me. They listen politely, and then they say they disagree, and then they tell me about their perspective on human rights. And I think that's part of the dialogue that we need to have as a world.
Understood. I want to ask one final question, and that is, you have spent an awfully long time in your life trying to make Canadians healthier, mostly through your perch at the University of Toronto and starting with young people. And I just wonder, as you look back on what you've been able to achieve, how much success do you think you've had making our population in general healthier?
Well, Steve, it's a very mixed story. Among the upper middle class, the middle class, privileged communities, I think everyone understands that. I think that everyone in the country understands that physical activity is inextricably linked to ongoing health, to resilience, to mental health, and so on. I think through all of the efforts that have been made over the last 50 years, that lesson has been clearly learned. But there are so many barriers to daily physical activity that most of the population encounter. There's so many barriers right now as a result of COVID, the closing of facilities, the suspension of physical education in the schools that make that very, very difficult. So I'm not worried about the message being out there, but I'm worried about the realization. 18 months ago, we hoped that in addressing COVID, we would build back better. I'm getting discouraged about that. I don't see any real effort to increase everyday opportunities for most people in physical activity. Some heartwarming, brilliant, isolated examples, but not across the board. We have to make the provision of sport for all, physical activity for all, a part of our national health system and a part of public education. That should be a basic, not a marginal activity, pretty much determined on whether or not you can pay for the opportunities through your family resources, or you live in one of those few very special communities dedicated to it. And that's a crisis.
Am I allowed to ask you how old you are now?
78.
You still got it, sir. Congratulations.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Thank you very much.
We are happy to remind people that your contribution to our continuing conversations about sports and politics and athletics and good health is A Runner's Journey by our guest, Bruce Kidd. Bruce, thanks so much for coming on to TVO tonight. We're really grateful.
Thank you, Steve. All the best to you.
That is the agenda for Thursday, October 28th, 2021. COVID-19 vaccines could soon be rolling out for children under 12. We'll get a primer on the science of those tomorrow. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda, or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.
How did Queen Victoria's mourning affect her children?
She was suffering from profound depression.
Her desire to restrict the lives of her children would become an obsession.
It's horrible, really.
The royal palaces became pressure cookers of sexual tension.
You cannot deny that Queen Victoria was a very difficult mother.
Soon, it would be all-out war between the Queen and her children, but there would only be one winner.
Queen Victoria and Her 9 Children continues tomorrow at 10 on TVO.
In spring 1943, 133 young men set out on the most daring and ingenious bombing raid in history to destroy the great dams of Germany using bombs that bounce.
Join historian Dan Snow as he relives the nail-biting countdown to the most daring bombing raid in history.
Nothing like it has ever been done before. If those dams could be destroyed, this would cause a devastating blow to Hitler's war machine.
But it would come at a terrible price.
The price of failure is paid with lives.
Within an hour, the men of 617 Squadron were under heavy enemy fire.
The Dam Busters story, November 6th on TVO.
Harry Potter and the Cursed Child arrives in Toronto June 2022. A brave new generation of wizards continue the story on stage in this 8th Harry Potter tale. It's time to believe in magic. Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, part of the 7-show season package. For information, mervish.com.
Explore more sides of a story. Consider it from a distinctly local point of view with journalists who live in the region. Ontario Hubs. Discover more on tvo.org and on The Agenda with Steve Paikin.
Removing Saddam Hussein from power was the right decision and rescued millions from unspeakable horrors.
And we will be drinking Jack Daniels to celebrate.
I was very happy to see them at that time. Like, hi.
But there would be no easy victory.
Things were changing so fast, we couldn't cope.
Something bad's gonna happen. And that's really, I realize, what are we getting into here?
Discover the human stories behind a war that would change the world.
And what we didn't